You have never told anyone something you saw. Maybe it was small. A coworker padding an expense report, a friend's lie to their partner. You said nothing. You told yourself it wasn't your business. But somewhere in your brain, a very old rule was firing. A rule older than laws, older than police, older than courts. That rule built one of the most powerful criminal networks in human history, and it is still running inside you right now. Sicily, the 19th century. No functioning central government, no trustworthy police, no court you could appeal to without a bribe changing hands first. Into that vacuum stepped men who offered something the state could not: protection, order, justice of a kind. But they demanded one thing in return: above money, above loyalty, above blood, silence. They called it omerta. The word itself is debated. Some trace it to omu, the Sicilian word for man, as if silence were the very definition of manhood. Others trace it to umiltà, humility, the idea that a real man humbly accepts his fate without appealing to outside authority. Either way, the message was identical. Never speak to outsiders. Never speak to the law. Handle everything inside the family. Break that rule and you didn't just lose your reputation, you lost your life. Here's the strange part. This code did not need constant enforcement to survive for a century. It replicated itself, quietly, socially, almost invisibly. And that is the part worth understanding, because the same mechanism is sitting inside your own social circles today. The economist Diego Gambetta spent years studying the Sicilian mafia not as a moral failure, but as an economic system. In his research, he argued that omertà functioned less like a rule imposed from above and more like a market signal. Silence told the world you could be trusted with dangerous information. Talking, even truthfully, made you a liability nobody wanted near them. Gambetta's analysis reframed the mafia entirely. It wasn't just a gang enforcing fear, it was a business selling protection in a world with no reliable alternative. And silence was simply the price of admission. Think about what that means. You weren't silent because you were forced to be in every single case. Sometimes you were silent because speaking made you unemployable inside the only economy available to you. Does that sound familiar? A workplace where reporting a manager quietly ends your career instead of theirs. The criminologist Donald Cressy, brought in decades ago to advise the United States government on organized crime, described something similar happening inside American mafia families. He noted that new members were rarely told the rule of silence in a single dramatic speech. Instead, it was absorbed, the way a child absorbs table manners, through observation, through small corrections, through watching what happened and did not happen to people around you. By the time a member fully understood omertà, they could not remember a moment they were taught it. It felt like something they always believed. That is not unique to organized crime. That is how every closed social system teaches its members what not to say. Now step back further, away from Sicily entirely, into a psychology lab in New York in the 1960s. Two researchers, Bibb Latané and John Darley, wanted to understand a disturbing pattern. In cities with more witnesses to an emergency, help often arrived slower, not faster. They ran a series of experiments and found something they named the bystander effect. When responsibility is shared among a group, each individual feels less personally obligated to act. Silence spreads not because people are cruel, but because everyone assumes someone else will speak first, or that speaking will single them out, or that staying quiet is simply safer. Omertà did not invent that instinct, it industrialized it. A village under mafia influence wasn't full of people who agreed with what was happening. Gambetta's later work made this explicit. Most people living under these codes were not true believers. They were rational actors calculating the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent. And in a broken justice system, silence almost always won the calculation. The mafia didn't need everyone to love them. It only needed everyone to do the math the same way. Here's the twist that makes this uncomfortable rather than merely historical. You do this math too, every single day. Solomon Asch, a psychologist working just a few years before Latane, and Darley ran a now famous experiment on conformity. He placed a real subject in a room with actors instructed to give an obviously wrong answer to a simple question, comparing line lengths. A large portion of real subjects, alone with no threat of violence hanging over them, gave the wrong answer too. Not because they couldn't see the correct one, because disagreeing with the group felt more costly than being factually wrong. No blood oath required, no Sicilian village required. Just a room, a group, and the quiet social penalty for speaking up. That is the real inheritance of omertà, not the mafia itself, which has been hunted, prosecuted, and diminished for decades by exactly the states it once outmaneuvered. The inheritance is the mechanism. The realization that silence can be manufactured without a single explicit threat, simply by making the cost of speaking higher than the cost of staying quiet. Look at your own workplace. Nobody hands new employees a card explaining which topics are off limits. Nobody needs to. You learn it from a raised eyebrow when someone mentions salary. You learn it from watching what happened to the one person who filed the complaint. You learn it the way Cressy's inductees learned it, by observing consequences instead of receiving instructions. Look at your own friend groups. There is likely a fact you know right now that you have chosen not to say out loud to someone who deserves to hear it. Not because a mafia boss threatened you, because some part of your brain ran the same calculation a Sicilian villager ran in 1890. What does speaking cost me? What does silence cost me? And silence, quietly, keeps winning. The mafia's genius was never violence alone. Violence is expensive, visible, and eventually draws the very authorities it hopes to avoid. The genius was building a system where violence rarely had to happen because everyone had already priced in the threats and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Fear became a background hum instead of a daily event. That is far more efficient than any enforcer walking door to door. And that explains why omertà outlives so many individual bosses, arrests, and even entire prosecutions. You cannot arrest a social calculation. You cannot put handcuffs on an incentive structure. Italian and American law enforcement eventually made real progress against the mafia, not primarily by punishing silence, but by changing the math. Witness protection programs, reduced sentences for cooperation. They made speaking cheaper than staying quiet, for the first time in a century. Only then did the silence begin to crack. That single insight might be the most useful thing this story hands you. Silence is not usually a moral failure in the people practicing it. It's a rational response to an environment where speaking costs more than staying quiet. If you want people to speak up, in a company, a family, a community, you don't need more rules demanding honesty. You need to lower the price of honesty and raise the price of silence, the same way investigators eventually did. So go back to that moment at the start. The coworker, the friend, the thing you saw and never mentioned. You told yourself it wasn't your business, but maybe it was never really about business at all. Maybe it was a rule older than any office, older than any courtroom, quietly asking you the same question it asked a Sicilian villager more than a century ago. What does speaking cost you? And for most of human history, in most rooms you've ever stood in, the answer has been enough to keep you quiet.